On the morning of January 4, 1863, a man stood before a crowd in Washington, D.C., holding a document that would legally erase 12 years of his life. His name was Solomon Northup. He had been a free citizen of New York. He had been kidnapped. He'd been sold. He had survived what the law had declared did not exist, a free man transformed into property through mechanisms the nation refused to examine. When he returned from Louisiana, he carried no visible scars that satisfied public curiosity. The newspapers wanted redemption. They wanted triumph. What they received instead was testimony so precise in its accounting of systematic erasure that the nation chose selective deafness. Within 15 years, Solomon Northup disappeared again. Not into slavery this time, into a silence more absolute than bondage. No grave was ever found. No death certificate exists. History swallowed him as efficiently as the plantation system had, leaving only his words behind, words that explained exactly how a free man could be unmade in the space between breakfast and nightfall. This is not a story about slavery. This is an examination of the legal, economic, and psychological machinery that allowed a man to be kidnapped in broad daylight, transported across state lines, held in the nation's capital within view of Congress, and sold into a system that required his personhood to be legally incoherent. What happened to Solomon Northup reveals not an aberration but a design, one so thoroughly integrated into American institutional life that his abduction required no conspiracy, only participation in existing systems of commerce and law. The horror is not in the exception, it is in the routine. Solomon Northup was born in July 1808 in Minerva, New York, a town in Essex County where wilderness had only recently yielded to settlement. His father, Mintus Northup, had been enslaved to a family named Northup in Rhode Island. When Mintus's enslaver died, the will granted him freedom. Mintus moved to New York, carrying the surname of his former owner as property records often required for recognition in legal documents. By the time Solomon was born, Mintus owned land, not much, enough. The distinction mattered in ways that structured every aspect of Solomon's childhood. In New York, property ownership granted black men limited voting rights. Mintus voted. He participated in town meetings. His freedom was not theoretical. It was documented in deeds and tax records that accumulated in courthouse files, each piece of paper a small fortress against the assumption that his presence required explanation. Solomon grew up understanding that freedom was not a condition of birth, but a status maintained through paperwork, through visibility in civic records, through the constant production of evidence that one belonged to oneself. He learned to read and write. He studied arithmetic. These were not ornamental skills. They were defensive measures. An enslaved person who could read was dangerous to the system. A free black man who could not read was vulnerable to it. The distinction meant everything. By his early 20s, Solomon had married Ann Hampton, a woman of mixed racial heritage from Sandy Hill, New York. They had 3 children. Solomon worked as a laborer, a raftsman floating timber down the waterways to markets in Troy and Albany. He played violin, a skill that brought additional income at dances and gatherings where white and black communities intersected under the fragile protocols of northern sociability. His life was modest, constrained by the limited economic opportunities available to free black men in upstate New York. But it was legible. His neighbors knew him. His family had roots. He appeared in census records. When he walked through Saratoga Springs or Sandy Hill, no one questioned his right to be there. This legibility was not safety, but it was a form of protection, a documentary shield that slavery's expansion had taught him to maintain with obsessive care. Then, in March 1841, 2 men approached him with an offer of employment. Their names were Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They claimed to be associated with a circus traveling to Washington, D.C. They needed a musician. The pay was generous. The duration was brief. They would cover all expenses. Solomon agreed. He had performed for traveling shows before. The work was temporary, the money useful. He informed Anne of the opportunity. He prepared for a short journey south, expecting to return within weeks. The 3 men traveled together from Saratoga Springs to Albany, then south to New York City. Brown and Hamilton were solicitous, companionable. They drank together. They stayed in hotels where Solomon's presence occasioned no comment, a detail he noted, because in northern cities, integrated public spaces existed in precarious pockets that could vanish with a proprietor's mood. In New York City, they visited the circus offices. Everything appeared legitimate. The contracts seemed standard. Then they continued south to Philadelphia, then to Baltimore. Then, on the morn, they arrived in Washington, D.C. Something shifted. Brown and Hamilton suggested a celebratory drink. The circus engagement would begin soon. They toasted to the success of the venture. Solomon remembered the taste of the liquor, then he remembered nothing. When consciousness returned, he was in darkness, in chains, in a cell beneath a building called Williams' Slave Pen, located on the National Mall less than half a mile from the Capitol building. The transition from freedom to captivity had occurred not in the wilderness, not in some remote corner of the South, but in the nation's capital, in a facility that operated openly, that paid municipal taxes, that appeared in business directories. The slave pen was not hidden. It was infrastructure. Williams's slave pen was operated by James H. Birch, a slave trader who had purchased the property in 1836 and converted it into a holding facility for enslaved people, awaiting sale or transport to southern markets. The building stood on 7th Street, across from the Smithsonian Institution grounds. Visitors to the Capitol could see it. Congressmen passed it on their way to session. It was not concealed because concealment was unnecessary. The domestic slave trade was legal. Washington, D.C., despite being a federal district, permitted the buying and selling of human beings within its boundaries. The Compromise of 1850 would eventually ban the slave trade in the district. But in 1841, when Solomon Northup woke in Birch's cell, the business was simply commerce. The pen contained multiple cells in the basement, holding areas on the ground floor, and an open yard where enslaved people were examined by prospective buyers. Birch employed overseers who maintained order through routine violence. When Solomon insisted he was a free man, when he demanded they verify his status, when he showed them the papers he carried, the response was immediate and methodical. They beat him, not in rage, in correction. He was told that he was a runaway slave from Georgia. He was told his name was Platt. He was told that if he continued to claim free status, the beatings would continue until the claims stopped. The logic of this violence was not punitive. It was pedagogical. Solomon's insistence on his freedom was not treated as a lie to be disproven, but as a delusion to be corrected through physical force. Birch did not need to investigate Solomon's claims. The law placed the burden of proof on the accused. A black man in chains claiming freedom had to produce documentation that satisfied white authorities. If the documentation was absent, if it was dismissed, if the authorities chose not to examine it, the claim dissolved. Solomon had papers. He had free papers issued in New York, but he was no longer in New York. He was in Washington, D.C., where James Birch had relationships with local magistrates, where the infrastructure of the slave trade had cultivated cooperative channels with law enforcement, where a black man's testimony carried no legal weight against a white man's assertion. Birch claimed Solomon was a slave. Solomon claimed he was free. The legal system did not weigh these claims equally. It defaulted to the claim that upheld existing property relations. Solomon was held in the pen for 2 weeks. During that time, he was examined by a doctor who noted his physical condition for sale purposes. He was stripped, measured, catalogued. His violin was gone. His clothes were replaced with the coarse garments worn by enslaved laborers. His name was changed in the ledger. The transformation from Solomon Northup to Platt was not metaphorical. It was administrative. The slave pen kept records. Birch documented his inventory. In those records, Solomon no longer existed. After 2 weeks, Solomon was transferred to a ship called the Orleans, a vessel that regularly transported enslaved people from Washington to New Orleans. The ship was owned by a company that operated within the legal framework of interstate commerce. Enslaved people were property. Property could be transported. The coastline shipping route from the Chesapeake Bay to the Gulf of Mexico was a major artery of the domestic slave trade, moving thousands of people annually from the declining agricultural economies of the Upper South to the expanding cotton plantations of the Deep South. Solomon was placed in the hold with approximately 40 other enslaved people. The conditions were not exceptional. They were standard. Limited space, minimal sanitation, rationed food. The voyage took 2 weeks. During the journey, a smallpox outbreak occurred. Several people died. Their bodies were thrown overboard. The ship continued. This was routine. When the Orleans arrived in New Orleans, Solomon was taken to a slave pen operated by a man named Theophilus Freeman. Freeman's establishment was located on Baronne Street. in the commercial district where such businesses clustered. New Orleans was the largest slave market in the United States. The city's economy depended on the trade. Auction houses operated openly. Newspapers advertised. Sales. The pens were not marginal operations. They were central to the city's financial architecture. Freeman inspected his new inventory. Solomon was listed as Platt, a field hand from Georgia. Capable, healthy, mid-30s. Freeman prepared him for sale. The preparation involved staging. Enslaved people in the pen were instructed to appear cheerful, energetic, compliant. They were told to smile when buyers entered. They were told to demonstrate vigor by jumping, by moving quickly, by responding to commands with alacrity. The performance was not voluntary. It was enforced. Those who failed to perform adequately were beaten. The beatings occurred in a small yard behind the pen, out of sight of buyers, a space designed specifically for the application of corrective violence that would not leave visible marks that might lower sale value. Solomon learned to perform. He had no choice. The alternative was not refusal. It was escalation of violence until compliance was achieved, or the person was rendered unsellable, at which point they would be sold at a loss to labor camps or industrial operations where life expectancy was measured in months. The market logic was efficient. Resistance had a price. If the price exceeded the person's value, the market disposed of the problem. Freeman sold Solomon to a Baptist preacher named William Prince Ford, who owned a lumber mill and plantation in the pine forests of Rapides Parish, Louisiana. Ford paid $1,800. The transaction was documented in a bill of sale that listed Solomon's age, physical description, and purchase price. The bill made no mention of Solomon's claim to freedom, because in the eyes of the law, the claim did not exist. Ford was considered by the standards of slaveholders a relatively humane master. He did not employ an overseer known for excessive violence. He allowed enslaved people to maintain small garden plots. He occasionally permitted religious gatherings. These concessions were not kindness, they were management techniques. Ford understood that a certain degree of autonomy reduced resistance, increased productivity, and lowered the costs associated with constant surveillance. His humanity, such as it was, existed within a framework that treated human beings as capital assets requiring maintenance. Solomon worked in the lumber mill, cutting and processing timber. The work was skilled. Solomon's literacy and mathematical ability became apparent. Ford used him for tasks that required calculation, for managing inventory and coordinating shipments. This created a problem. Solomon's competence made him valuable. His value made him a target. There was a man named John Tibeats, a carpenter employed by Ford to construct buildings on the plantation. Tibeats was perpetually in debt, perpetually angry, perpetually looking for someone to blame for his failures. He saw Solomon's competence as insubordination. When Ford assigned Solomon to work under Tibeats' supervision, the arrangement lasted less than a month before Tibeats attempted to kill him. The incident began over the installation of nails. Tibeats ordered Solomon to use specific nails for a construction project. Solomon, who had more experience with carpentry than Tibeats possessed, suggested a different approach that would be more structurally sound. Tibeats perceived the suggestion as defiance. He attacked Solomon with a whip. Solomon, in a moment that would define the rest of his captivity, fought back. He took the whip from Tibeats and struck him. Then he tied him up. This was not rebellion, it was self-defense. But under Louisiana law, an enslaved person who struck a white man, regardless of provocation, had committed a crime punishable by death. Solomon knew this. He also knew that if he did not resist, Tibeats would kill him in that moment. The choice was between certain death and probable death. He chose probability. Ford intervened before Tibeats could summon a lynch mob. Ford's intervention was not motivated by moral outrage at Tibeats' behavior. It was motivated by property protection. Solomon was worth $1,800. Allowing Tibeats to destroy that investment made no economic sense. But Ford also understood that Solomon could no longer remain on his plantation. An enslaved person who had struck a white man could not be permitted to remain without undermining the entire disciplinary structure that kept the system functional. Ford sold Solomon to Tibeats to settle a debt Tibeats owed him. The sale price was $400, less than a quarter of what Ford had paid. The discount reflected Solomon's new status as damaged goods, a dangerous asset, a person who had demonstrated the capacity for resistance. Tibeats now owned Solomon. The implications were clear. Tibeats would attempt to kill him. It was not a question of if, It was a question of when. Solomon ran. He fled into the swamps, wading through water to avoid tracking dogs, moving at night, hiding during the day. He had no destination. He had no plan beyond survival. After several days, he returned to Ford's plantation, not because Ford would protect him, but because dying in the swamps was certain, and returning to Ford offered a marginal chance that Ford's economic interest might override Tibeats' desire for revenge. Ford again intervened. He could not legally prevent Tibeats from doing whatever he wished with his own property, but he could broker another sale. Ford sold Solomon again, this time to a planter named Edwin Epps, who owned a cotton plantation in Bayou Boeuf. The sale price was not recorded. Solomon entered the machinery of cotton production, the engine of the Southern economy, the system that generated the wealth that funded the railroads and banks and industries of the entire nation. Cotton plantations were not farms, they were factories. The crop required intensive labor during planting and especially during harvest, when the cotton bolls matured and had to be picked within a narrow window to prevent loss. The work was measured, quantified, optimized. Each enslaved person was assigned a daily quota based on their demonstrated capacity. The quotas were recorded in plantation ledgers. Those who exceeded quota received minimal rewards, sometimes an extra ration, sometimes nothing. Those who failed to meet quota were whipped. The number of lashes corresponded to the deficit. If the quota was 100 pounds and the picker brought in 90 pounds, the deficit was 10 pounds. The whipping was 10 lashes. This was not cruelty. It was accounting. Edwin Epps was a man who believed with absolute conviction that God had ordained slavery, that black people were descendants of Ham, cursed to servitude, and that any attempt to educate them or treat them as EQ. Ewell's was a violation of divine law. He was also an alcoholic whose drinking made him unpredictable and violent. His wife, Mary Epps, shared his theological convictions but resented the presence of enslaved women on the plantation, particularly those her husband found attractive. This resentment expressed itself in demands for their punishment, in accusations of laziness or insolence that required correction, in a gendered violence that targeted women for the crime of being desired by a man who owned them. Solomon spent 10 years on Epps's plantation, 10 years of cotton, 10 years of quotas, 10 years of watching people beaten for shortfalls in weight, for perceived slowness, for meeting the eyes of an overseer in a way that could be interpreted as defiance. He learned that survival required invisibility, required the suppression of any quality that might distinguish him from the mass of laborers, required the elimination of self-expression beyond what was necessary to perform assigned tasks. He stopped speaking about his past. He stopped mentioning New York. He stopped claiming freedom. The claim had only ever brought violence. Silence was not safety, but it was the only strategy that reduced the frequency of assault. There was a woman on Epps's plantation named Patsy. She was in her early 20s, born into slavery, never known anything else. She was the fastest cotton picker on the plantation, routinely exceeding her quota by significant margins. This made her valuable to Epps. It also made her a target. Epps raped her regularly. Mary Epps, enraged by her husband's assaults and unable or unwilling to direct that rage at him, demanded that Patsy be punished for inciting his lust. The logic was common. Enslaved women were held responsible for the sexual violence inflicted upon them. Their bodies were sites of contested ownership between masters and mistresses, and the resolution of that contest invariably involved the woman suffering. Patsy tried to resist, not through defiance, which would have been suicidal, but through small acts of autonomy. She left the plantation one day without permission to obtain soap from a nearby plantation because Epps refused to provide adequate supplies for bathing. When she returned, Epps demanded she be whipped. He ordered Solomon to do it. This was another element of the system's design. Enslaved people were forced to inflict violence on each other, to participate in their own oppression, to internalize the logic of punishment so thoroughly that resistance became not just dangerous but psychologically incoherent. Solomon refused. Epps beat him and ordered an overseer to perform the whipping instead. Patsy was stripped and tied to a post. The overseer delivered the lashes. Solomon was forced to watch. The number of lashes was excessive, intended not to correct but to destroy. Patsy nearly died. She survived, but something in her broke that was not physical. Years passed in this pattern. Cotton seasons, whippings, the occasional arrival of new enslaved people purchased at market, the occasional sale of someone no longer productive. Solomon watched people die, some from disease, some from violence, some from despair. Suicide was not uncommon. It was another form of resistance, a final assertion of agency in a system designed to eliminate choice. The plantation ledgers recorded these deaths clinical. Why? They were losses, depreciations of capital, entries in the debit column that affected the estate's overall value. There was no mourning. There were no funerals. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the fields, and the next day the work continued. Solomon began to lose hope, not dramatically, gradually. Hope eroded like soil under constant rain, washing away in increments too small to measure until one day he realized the landscape had changed. He was 31 when he was kidnapped. He was 41 when a white carpenter from Canada named Samuel Bass arrived at Epps's plantation to do construction work. Bass was an abolitionist, not a radical, not someone who participated in Underground Railroad activities, just a man who believed slavery was wrong and said so in conversations with Epps. These conversations disturbed the social protocols that normally governed interaction between white men in the South. Epps tolerated Bass because he needed the carpentry work, but the presence of a white man who openly criticized slavery created a fissure in the plantation's disciplinary architecture. Solomon took an enormous risk. He spoke to Bass. He told him his story. He asked Bass to send a letter to New York, to contacts who could verify his identity and free status. Bass could have refused. He could have informed Epps, which would have resulted in Solomon's death. He could have taken the information and done nothing, which would have been safer than involving himself in a legal challenge to a planter's property rights. Instead, Bass sent the letter. The letter reached Ann Northup in Saratoga Springs. Ann contacted a local lawyer named Henry B. Northup, a Whit E. man from the same family that had once enslaved Solomon's father. Henry Northup had known Solomon as a child. He believed the story. He traveled to Louisiana, armed with documentation of Solomon's free status, certified copies of birth records and manumission papers and affidavits from New York residents who could testify to Solomon's identity. Henry Northup arrived in Bayou Boeuf in January 1853 and presented his evidence to a local magistrate. The magistrate examined the documents. Under Louisiana law, a free person held in slavery had the right to petition for release, but the burden of proof was extraordinary. The petitioner had to produce witnesses, had to provide certified documentation, had to convince a legal system invested in maintaining property rights that this particular piece of property was actually a person. The hearing was brief. Edwin Epps protested the claim. He insisted that Platt was his legal property, purchased in good faith, and that this was an attempt to defraud him of his investment. The magistrate reviewed the documents. He called witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. Solomon Northup was a free man. On January 4, 1853, the magistrate ordered Solomon's release. 12 years had passed since he had been kidnapped, 12 years during which his family did not know if he was alive, 12 years during which he had been erased from legal existence, transformed into property, worked as a machine, beaten as livestock. The moment of release was not cinematic. There was no dramatic reunion on the plantation. Solomon was handed his free papers and told he could leave. Edwin Epps received no compensation. The law recognized that he had purchased stolen property, and stolen property had to be returned regardless of the innocence of the purchaser. Epps was furious, but he was also aware that pursuing the matter would require challenging a decision supported by extensive documentation and testimony from white witnesses. He let Solomon go. Solomon traveled back to New York with Henry Northup. The journey took weeks. When he arrived in Saratoga Springs, his family had aged beyond the years that had passed and had worked as a cook to support their children. The children were adults now. They did not recognize their father. He did not recognize them. The reunion was strained, marked by silences that neither side could bridge. Solomon had experienced something that could not be explained in the parlors of upstate New York, and his family had experienced an absence that could not be filled by his return. Solomon decided to write an account of his captivity. He partnered with a local editor named David Wilson, who helped structure the narrative and prepare it for publication. The book, titled 12 Years a Slave, was published in 1853. It sold 30,000 copies in its first 3 years, an extraordinary success for the time. The book was not a polemic, it was testimony. Solomon described the mechanics of kidnapping, the operations of the slave pens, the economics of the cotton plantation, the legal structures that permitted free black citizens to be transformed into property. He named names. He identified James Birch, the slave trader in Washington. He identified Theophilus Freeman, the slave trader in New Orleans. He identified Edwin Epps, the planter who had held him for 10 years. The identifications were risky. Birch and Freeman were still operating their businesses. Epps was still farming cotton. But Solomon understood that without specificity, without documentation, his account would be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda. He provided details that could be verified. He included dates, locations, prices. The book was used by abolitionists as evidence of slavery's horrors, but it was also something more dangerous. It was a manual. It explained how the system worked. It revealed the legal mechanisms, the commercial networks, the administrative procedures that allowed free people to be kidnapped and enslaved. This was not a story about Southern barbarism. It was an exposé of a national infrastructure that included northern cities, northern ships, northern banks that financed the trade, northern industries that consumed the cotton. The publication of the book led to legal action. New York prosecutors brought kidnapping charges against James Birch and the men who had lured Solomon to Washington, Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. The charges were based on New York law, which made it illegal to kidnap a free person for the purpose of enslavement. But the trial revealed the limits of Northern anti-slavery commitment. Birch's defense argued that he had purchased Solomon in good faith from Brown and Hamilton, believing them to be legitimate slave traders. Brown and Hamilton had disappeared and could not be located for testimony. Without their testimony, the prosecution could not prove that Birch knew Solomon was free. The case collapsed. Birch was acquitted. The legal system had absorbed Solomon's testimony, acknowledged the crime, and then declined to punish it because the evidentiary standards required to convict a white man of kidnapping a black man were insurmountable. The message was clear. Solomon's freedom had been restored, but justice had not been achieved. The system that had enabled his kidnapping remained intact, its operators free to continue their business, protected by legal standards that made prosecution nearly impossible. Solomon lectured for a few years after the book's publication. He spoke to abolitionist groups, to churches, to anyone willing to listen. The lectures were well attended at first. People wanted to hear from someone who had survived, who could testify to the realities of slavery from personal experience. But the public's attention was fickle. By the late 1850s, interest had waned. The political crisis over slavery's expansion into new territories dominated national attention. Individual stories of suffering, no matter how compelling, could not compete with the broader sectarian conflict that was pushing the nation toward war. Solomon's lectures became less frequent. The invitations stopped. By 1857, he had largely disappeared from public view. Census records from 1860 do not list him. There is no death certificate. No grave has been identified. Historical records simply stop mentioning Solomon Northup sometime in the late 1850s. He vanished as completely as he had when he was kidnapped. Only this time there was no dramatic rescue, no legal hearing, no restoration. He simply ceased to exist in the documentary record. The disappearance raises questions that historians have never satisfactorily answered. Did Solomon die? If so, where and how? Did he leave New York? Some researchers have speculated that he traveled to Canada, where he might have felt safer from the possibility of re-enslavement under the Fugitive Slave Act, which remained in effect and posed a theoretical threat even to those with documented free status. Others have suggested that he may have died in poverty, unclaimed and unrecorded, buried in an unmarked grave as so many were in that era. The lack of records is itself revealing. Solomon Northup, a man whose freedom had required extensive legal documentation, whose identity had been certified by multiple courts and witnesses, whose story had been published and widely read, disappeared without leaving a trace in the systems of record-keeping that govern 19th-century American life. It was as if the nation, having briefly acknowledged his existence, returned to the more comfortable position of erasure. His story had served its purpose. It had provided ammunition for abolitionists. It had demonstrated the horrors of slavery to Northern audiences. But once that utility was exhausted, once the political moment moved on, Solomon himself became expendable. The person mattered less than the narrative, and the narrative had been extracted. The legal and institutional structures that enabled Solomon's kidnapping did not disappear with the Civil War, they adapted. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for crime. That exception became the foundation for convict leasing, a system that allowed southern states to arrest black men on minor or fabricated charges and lease them to plantations, mines, and industrial operations, where they worked under conditions indistinguishable from slavery. The mechanisms of capture, detention, and forced labor persisted. They simply changed vocabulary. Slave became convict. Plantation became labor camp. The administrative logic remained. Black bodies were transformed into economic units through legal processes that claimed neutrality while serving extraction. The kidnapping of free black people also did not end with abolition. Throughout the late 19th century, reports surfaced of black individuals being seized and transported to remote labor camps in the South. These kidnappings were rarely prosecuted. The victims were often migrants, people traveling for work, people without extensive documentation, people whose disappearance occasioned no legal inquiry because they existed at the margins of civic legibility. The systems Solomon described in his book continued to function because they were embedded in legal structures that survived the formal end of slavery. The question that lingers, the question Solomon's story demands, is not why his kidnapping happened. The mechanisms are clear. The legal framework is documented. The economic incentives are obvious. The question is why it was allowed to happen. Why did the United States maintain a capital district where slave pens operated within sight of Congress? Why did northern banks finance the domestic slave trade? Why did northern ships transport enslaved people? Why did northern consumers purchase cotton knowing it was produced by forced labor? The answer is that the system worked. It generated wealth, it maintained social hierarchies, it allowed the nation to expand westward and develop industrially without confronting the fundamental contradiction at its core. Slavery was not a Southern problem. It was a national architecture. Solomon Northup's kidnapping was possible because the entire apparatus of American law, commerce, and governance was designed to permit it. When he was seized in Washington, the crime occurred not in defiance of the system, but because of it. The slave pen was legal, the transport was legal, the sale was legal. Every step of his transformation from person to property followed procedures that were documented, regulated, and enforced by state and federal authorities. The slave pen where Solomon was held in Washington was located at what is now the intersection of 7th Street and Maryland Avenue, a few blocks from the National Mall. The building no longer exists. There is no marker, no plaque. The site is now occupied by federal office buildings and parking lots. This absence is not accidental. It is a choice. The erasure of the slave pens from Washington's landscape mirrors the erasure of slavery from the nation's founding narrative. The Capitol was built in part by enslaved labor. The White House was constructed by enslaved workers. The Capitol building was built by enslaved workers. These facts are documented in historical records, but they were excluded from official histories for more than a century. The Smithsonian Institution, which stood across from Williams's slave pen, did not address the history of slavery in its exhibitions until the late 20th century. The National Mall, designed as a space of national commemoration, contained no acknowledgement of slavery's role in the nation's development until 2016, when the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened. The delay was not due to lack of knowledge. It was due to a deliberate decision to prioritize narratives of progress and democracy over narratives of exploitation and racial terror. Solomon Northup's book was one of several slave narratives published in the antebellum period. Frederick Douglass's narrative appeared in 1845. Harriet Jacobs's narrative was published in 1861. These texts shared common features. They documented the violence of slavery. They demonstrated the intellectual capacity of enslaved people. They challenged the racial ideologies that justified bondage. But they also served a specific function in the abolitionist movement. They provided Northern audiences with testimony that could be consumed without confronting Northern complicity. Readers could focus on the Southern planter, the slave trader, the overseer, figures who could be easily categorized as villains. What was harder to confront was the system that enabled those figures to operate, the legal structures maintained by Congress, the financial networks centered in New York and Boston, the consumer demand for cheap cotton that drove the expansion of plantation slavery. Solomon's narrative implicated the North. He was kidnapped in Washington. He was held in a pen that operated legally. He was transported on a northern ship. But these implications were muted in the public reception of his book. Reviews focused on his suffering, on his resilience, on the dramatic rescue. They did not focus on the fact that his kidnapping had been facilitated by institutions that continued to function after his release. The legal case against James Birch illustrated the limits of Northern anti-slavery politics. New York had passed laws against kidnapping free black people as early as 1817. These laws were strengthened in 1840, the year before Solomon was kidnapped, but the laws were rarely enforced. Prosecution required resources, required political will, required a legal system willing to prioritize the rights of black victims over the property claims of white defendants. Birch's acquittal demonstrated that even when a case was brought, even when the victim could testify, even when the evidence was documented, conviction was nearly impossible. The burden of proof was structured to favor the defendant. Birch's claim that he had purchased Solomon in good faith was sufficient to create reasonable doubt. The fact that Solomon had been held in chains, that he had insisted he was free, that he had been beaten for making that claim, was not sufficient to overcome the presumption that a white businessman had acted legally. The legal system treated Birch's word as more credible than Solomon's testimony, despite the fact that Solomon's account was corroborated by documentary evidence and multiple witnesses. This was not a failure of the legal system. It was the system functioning as designed. The question of how Solomon spent his final years, where he died, and why no record exists, is not simply a biographical mystery. It is a structural question about who gets remembered and how memory is institutionalized. Solomon's story was useful to the abolitionist movement because it demonstrated that slavery could reach across state lines and claim even those with legal documentation of freedom. His story illustrated the vulnerability of all black people in a nation that treated racial status as a form of property that could override individual rights. But once the Civil War began, once the political crisis escalated to armed conflict, individual narratives of suffering became less relevant. The war generated its own martyrs, its own heroes, its own stories of sacrifice and redemption. Solomon's story, already more than a decade old by the time Fort Sumter was fired upon, receded into the background. Abolitionists moved on to other concerns. The public's attention shifted to the war effort. Solomon himself, no longer a compelling speaker, no longer a fresh testimony, became redundant. The nation had extracted what it needed from him. His continued existence was immaterial. This pattern would repeat throughout American history. The stories of black suffering would be invoked when politically useful, when they could serve as evidence in debates over policy or moral authority. But the individuals who provided those testimonies, who had survived the systems being debated, were rarely integrated into the ongoing political and social life of the nation. They were cited, not consulted. Their narratives were commodified, extracted and deployed without addressing the structural conditions that had produced their suffering. Solomon's book sold 30,000 copies. The profits went to the publisher and to Solomon, though records do not indicate how much he received. What is clear is that the financial success of the book did not translate into long-term security for Solomon or his family. By the time he disappeared from the historical record, there is no evidence that he had accumulated any wealth. The story of his suffering had value. The person who had suffered did not. The slave pen in New Orleans, where Solomon was held by Theophilus Freeman, was located on Baronne Street, in what is now the Central Business District. The site is now occupied by a parking garage. There is no marker. The New Orleans slave market was the largest in the United States, processing thousands of enslaved people annually, through auctions and private sales. The infrastructure of the trade, the pens, the auction houses, the offices of the traders, was demolished in the decades after the Civil War, not because of moral revulsion, but because the land became more valuable for other uses. The absence of physical markers makes it easy to forget that these institutions existed, that they operated in the open, that they were integrated into the urban fabric of American cities. Tourists walk past the site of Freeman's slave pen without knowing it. The city's historic preservation efforts have focused on architecture, on the French Quarter, on the antebellum mansions, but not on the sites where the enslaved were bought and sold. This selective memory is a choice. It reflects a decision about which parts of history merit commemoration and which are allowed to fade. Edwin Epps, the planter who held Solomon for 10 years, continued to operate his plantation after Solomon's release. There is no evidence that he faced any legal consequences for holding a free man in slavery. The magistrate's decision ordered Solomon's release, but did not punish Epps for the decade of forced labor. Under Louisiana law, Epps's defense would have been that he purchased Solomon in good faith from a legitimate slave trader, and therefore had no knowledge that Solomon was free. This defense, the same one that protected James Birch, shielded Epps from prosecution. The legal framework treated enslavement as a property transaction, and property transactions entered into in good faith were protected, even when the property turned out to be stolen. The principle of protecting innocent purchasers took precedence over the rights of the enslaved. Epps died in 1867. His obituary made no mention of Solomon Northup. His estate was probated. His land and remaining enslaved people, freed by the 13th Amendment, were inventoried and distributed to his heirs. He was buried in a local cemetery. His grave is marked. Solomon's is not. The asymmetry of commemoration is stark. The perpetrators of Solomon's kidnapping and enslavement lived and died as ordinary citizens. Their graves are marked. Their property passed to descendants. Their participation in the slave trade and slavery was not treated as a crime, was not remembered as a moral failing, was not allowed to overshadow their identities as businessmen, planters, fathers, church members. Solomon, the victim, disappeared without a trace. His grave, if it exists, has never been found. His final years are unknown. The documentary record that had been so crucial to his survival, that had enabled his release, failed to capture his death. This failure is not an accident. It is the result of systems that valued certain lives as worth documenting and others as disposable. Solomon's value, in the eyes of the institutions that might have recorded his death, ended when his story was no longer useful. The person was irrelevant once the testimony had been extracted. The publication of 12 Years a Slave in 1853 coincided with a period of intense national debate over slavery's expansion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 would repeal the Missouri Compromise and allow settlers in new territories to decide whether to permit slavery. The resulting violence in Kansas, the attacks on abolitionists, the beating of Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor demonstrated that the sectional conflict was escalating beyond political negotiation. Solomon's book was part of this literature of crisis, but it was also distinct from it. Most abolitionist writing focused on the moral arguments against slavery. Solomon's narrative was procedural. It explained how the system worked. It detailed the legal mechanisms, the commercial networks, the administrative processes. This procedural detail made the book valuable as evidence, but it also made it uncomfortable. It implicated not just individual slaveholders but entire systems of law and commerce. Northern readers could condemn Edwin Epps as a cruel master, but it was harder to condemn the banks that financed his plantation, the ships that transported his cotton, the mills that processed it into cloth. Solomon's narrative revealed the integration of slavery into the national economy in ways that challenged the regional distinctions. Abolitionists often relied upon the trial of James Birch in 1853 was held in Washington, D.C., and attracted significant public attention. The courtroom was crowded with spectators. Newspaper reporters covered the proceedings. The prosecution presented evidence of Solomon's kidnapping, including testimony from Solomon himself and documentary proof of his free status. Birch's defense argued that he had no knowledge Solomon was free, that he had purchased him from Brown and Hamilton in a legitimate transaction, and that his business practices complied with all applicable laws. The jury deliberated for several hours and returned a verdict of not guilty. The verdict was not surprising. Convicting a white businessman of kidnapping based on the testimony of a black man, even one whose free status was documented, required a jury willing to privilege the victim's account over the defendant's claim of innocence. In the context of Washington, D.C., a city where the slave trade was legal and where traders like Birch were established, members of the business community, such a verdict was unlikely. The acquittal meant that the men who had kidnapped Solomon, Brown, Hamilton, and Birch, faced no legal consequences. The system had acknowledged the crime but declined to punish it. The economic value of an enslaved person in the mid-19th century varied based on age, health, skills, and market conditions. In 1841, when Solomon was sold in New Orleans, the average price for a healthy adult male field hand was approximately $1,200. Solomon was sold to William Ford for $1,800, reflecting his skills and physical condition. When Ford sold him to Tibeats, the price dropped to $400, reflecting the damage to his value caused by his resistance. These prices were not arbitrary. They were determined by supply and demand, by the productivity of cotton, by the availability of land in the expanding southwestern territories. The prices were recorded in ledgers, in bills of sale, in estate inventories. The enslaved were assets, and like all assets, Their value fluctuated based on market conditions. This commodification was total. It was not a metaphor. It was an accounting practice. Plantation owners calculated their wealth based on land and enslaved people. Banks accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. Insurance companies sold policies to protect slaveholders against the loss of their human property. The entire financial system was structured around the treatment of people as capital. Solomon's description of the cotton-picking process on Edwin Epps's plantation provides insight into the logic of quota systems. Each enslaved person was required to pick a certain weight of cotton per day. The quotas were determined by the individual's demonstrated capacity, not by a universal standard. A strong, experienced picker might have a quota of 200 pounds. A weaker or less skilled picker might have a quota of 100 pounds. The quotas were recalibrated throughout the season based on performance. If someone consistently exceeded their quota, the quota was raised. This created a perverse incentive. Exceeding quota did not result in lighter workloads or greater autonomy. It resulted in higher expectations and harsher punishment for future shortfalls. The system was designed to extract maximum labor while minimizing costs. The use of violence was not sadistic. It was instrumental. The whippings were calibrated to the deficits. They were recorded in overseer logs. The plantation operated as a rationalized system of labor extraction in which violence was a management tool, deployed with the same calculated precision as fertilizer or irrigation. The sexual violence that Solomon witnessed on Epps's plantation, particularly the assaults on Patsy, illustrated the gender dimensions of slavery's terror. Enslaved women faced dual exploitation. They were laborers subject to the same quotas and punishments as men. They were also subject to sexual violence from slaveholders and overseers. This violence was not incidental. It was structural. Enslaved women could not refuse the sexual demands of their owners. Refusal would result in punishment or sale. The resulting children were born into slavery, increasing the owner's property. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women was economically rational within the logic of slavery. It produced more enslaved people at no cost. The involvement of white women in this system, exemplified by Mary Epps's demand that Patsy be punished for being raped by Edwin Epps, revealed the complicity of white women in slavery's maintenance. White women were not passive bystanders. They participated in the violence, either directly by demanding punishment or indirectly by upholding the social structures that made sexual violence permissible. The role of religion in justifying slavery cannot be overstated. Edwin Epps believed that slavery was ordained by God. This was not an idiosyncratic belief. It was mainstream theology in the antebellum South. Ministers preached from pulpits that slavery was biblically sanctioned, that the curse of Ham justified the enslavement of Africans, that the social order depended on maintaining divinely established hierarchies. These sermons were delivered in churches attended by slaveholders and enslaved people alike. The enslaved were required to attend, required to listen to their own subjugation described as God's will. This religious justification performed crucial ideological work. It transformed an economic system into a moral order. It allowed slaveholders to reconcile their Christianity with their participation in a system of exploitation and violence. It also created psychological barriers to resistance. If slavery was God's will, then resistance was not just dangerous, it was sinful. The theological justification made the system more stable because it internalized the logic of domination, making enslaved people question whether freedom was even righteous. The Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and routes that helped enslaved people escape to free states and Canada, operated throughout the period of Solomon's captivity. But the Underground Railroad was not accessible to most enslaved people. It required knowledge of the network, which was closely guarded. It required assistance from abolitionists, who were few in the Deep South. It required the ability to travel long distances without being detected, which was nearly impossible for enslaved people on isolated plantations who were subject to constant surveillance. Solomon considered escape multiple times. He understood the geography. He knew that freedom existed to the north, but he also understood that the likelihood of successful escape from a Louisiana plantation was minimal. The distance to free territory was hundreds of miles. The journey would require crossing rivers, avoiding patrols, finding food and shelter, navigating without maps or assistance. The penalty for being caught was death. The risk calculation was brutal. The rational choice in terms of survival was often to endure rather than attempt escape. This was not cowardice, it was an assessment of probabilities in a system designed to make escape nearly impossible. When Solomon was finally released in 1853, the legal process that had secured his freedom was itself revealing of the racial hierarchies embedded in law. Solomon could not simply present himself to a magistrate and demand release. He needed a white lawyer, Henry Northup, to represent him. He needed certified documentation from New York proving his free status. He needed white witnesses willing to testify on his behalf. Even with all of this, the hearing was not guaranteed to rule in his favor. The magistrate had discretion. If the magistrate had been more sympathetic to Epps, or if the documentation had been less thorough, or if the white witnesses had been less credible, Solomon could have remained enslaved. The law did not automatically protect free black people. It provided a narrow procedural path that required resources, connections, and luck. The fact that Solomon navigated this path successfully was extraordinary. The fact that the path existed at all was portrayed as evidence of the legal system's fairness. But the existence of such a path did not negate the fact that Solomon had been held for 12 years, that the system had enabled his kidnapping, that the burden of proof had rested entirely on him to prove his humanity. The financial compensation question looms over Solomon's story. When he was released, he received no compensation for 12 years of forced labor. Edwin Epps, who had profited from that labor, lost nothing except the future use of a person he should never have owned. James Birch, who had facilitated the kidnapping, was acquitted and continued his business. The men who lured Solomon to Washington were never prosecuted. The system provided no mechanism for restitution. This was not an oversight. It was consistent with the legal framework that treated enslaved people as property. Property that was stolen had to be returned, but the owner of stolen property had no claim against the thief for the value of the property's use during the theft. Solomon's labor had generated profit for Ford, for Tibeats, for Epps. That profit was not recoverable. The law recognized Solomon's freedom, but not his right to compensation for the theft of his labor and his life. This asymmetry persisted long after slavery ended. Formerly enslaved people received no compensation for their labor. Slaveholders, in some cases, received compensation for the loss of their property when slavery was abolished in British colonies, a model that was discussed but not implemented in the United States. The question of reparations, of compensating those who had been enslaved and their descendants, was deferred and remains unresolved. The publication of Solomon's narrative in book form was not purely altruistic. David Wilson, the editor who helped prepare the manuscript, owned the copyright. He received royalties from sales. This was standard practice for the time. Slave narratives were commercial products. They sold because there was a market for them, a reading public interested in stories of suffering and redemption. The narrative served abolitionist purposes, but they also generated profit for publishers, editors, and booksellers. The commodification of Solomon's suffering is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but it was real. His story was valuable because it was marketable. The book's success depended on its ability to appeal to Northern audiences who wanted to feel morally superior to Southern slaveholders, while avoiding uncomfortable questions about their own complicity. The narrative was structured to satisfy this demand. It focused on Solomon's individual suffering and resilience. It provided villains, Birch, Epps, Tibeats, who could be easily condemned. It offered a resolution in which Solomon was rescued and returned to freedom. This narrative arc was satisfying. It was also incomplete. It did not address the systemic questions, the institutional complicity, the ongoing vulnerability of free black people to kidnapping and enslavement. The use of Solomon's testimony in abolitionist propaganda sometimes distorted his narrative in ways that served political goals but erased complexity. Abolitionist speakers would excerpt the most dramatic passages, the whippings, the separation of families, the sexual violence, and present them as evidence of slavery's inherent cruelty. This was true, but it was also reductive. Solomon's narrative was not just about cruelty. It was about systems. It was about how legal, economic, and social structures combined to make kidnapping and enslavement possible. It was about how ordinary people, traders, ship captains, overseers, magistrates, participated in the system not as monsters, but as functionaries performing their roles within a framework that normalized atrocity. Reducing the narrative to individual acts of cruelty made it easier to condemn slavery without confronting the structural reforms necessary to dismantle it. It allowed audiences to feel outrage without accepting responsibility. This pattern of extracting testimony, simplifying it, and deploying it for political purposes without addressing systemic complicity is not unique to the abolitionist movement. It has recurred throughout American history whenever narratives of racial injustice are invoked. Solomon's disappearance from the historical record after 1857 mirrors the broader erasure of black voices from American public life in the late 19th century. The Reconstruction period, which briefly expanded political rights for black citizens, was followed by the Redemption period, in which those rights were systematically stripped away through violence, legal maneuvering, and political disenfranchisement. The voices of formerly enslaved people, which had been prominent in abolitionist literature and in early Reconstruction politics, were silenced. The narratives that survived in public memory were those that white audiences found acceptable, stories of individual uplift and accommodation, rather than structural critique. Solomon's narrative, with its detailed exposure of systemic complicity, was less palatable than stories that emphasized personal resilience without implicating Northern institutions. The book went out of print. It was not republished until the 1960s, when the civil rights movement created renewed interest in historical accounts of racial injustice. For more than a century, Solomon's testimony was effectively erased from public consciousness. The question of why Solomon's grave has never been found is complicated by the burial practices of the 19th century. Not all burials were recorded, especially for those who died in poverty or obscurity. Cemetery records from the period are incomplete. Many cemeteries did not maintain detailed maps of individual graves. Burials in paupers' graves were often unmarked. If Solomon died without resources, his burial might not have been recorded at all. His family might not have been able to afford a marked grave. The absence of a grave marker does not mean there is no grave. It means the grave is unmarked, unknown, lost to the same archival silence that characterizes so much of black history in America. The inability to locate Solomon's final resting place is a metaphor for the broader historical erasure, the systemic failure to document and preserve the lives of those whose suffering the nation preferred to forget. The legal framework that enabled Solomon's kidnapping was not dismantled by the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but created an exception for those convicted of crimes. This exception became the basis for the convict leasing system that emerged in the South during Reconstruction. State governments passed laws that criminalized behaviors associated with black life, vagrancy, loitering, breach of contract for sharecroppers, and then leased the convicted to plantations, mines, and industrial operations. The convicts worked under conditions indistinguishable from slavery. They were beaten. They were worked to death. The system generated revenue for state governments and labor for private companies. The legal mechanism was different, but the functional outcome was the same. Black bodies were transformed into economic units through processes that claimed legal legitimacy. The men who operated the convict leasing system were not slaveholders in the legal sense, but they performed the same role. They profited from forced labor. They used violence to maintain discipline. They treated the people they controlled as disposable. The system persisted into the 20th century. The last convict leasing contracts were not terminated until the 1940s. The kidnapping of free black people continued after the Civil War. The mechanisms adapted. Instead of slave traders operating openly, kidnappers operated clandestinely. They targeted migrants, people traveling for work, people whose absence would not be immediately noticed. The victims were taken to remote labor camps in the South where they were held under conditions of peonage, legally distinct from slavery but functionally identical. These kidnappings were rarely investigated. Law enforcement in the regions where the labor camps operated was either complicit or indifferent. The victims had no recourse. Even when they escaped and reported the crime, prosecution was difficult because the burden of proof remained insurmountable. The kidnappers claimed the victims were voluntary workers who had breached contracts. The victims had no documentation to prove otherwise. The legal framework favored the employers. This pattern persisted into the early 20th century. Reports of peonage camps surfaced periodically in the press, prompted by particularly egregious cases or by the escape of victims who reached sympathetic authorities. But the system itself was not dismantled because it served economic interests that had political protection. The financial records of the domestic slave trade reveal the scale of the system Solomon was caught within. Between 1820 and 1860, Approximately 1 million enslaved people were transported from the Upper South to the Deep South. This internal migration was driven by the collapse of tobacco agriculture in Virginia and Maryland, and the expansion of cotton production in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. The trade was highly organized. Companies specialized in the transport of enslaved people. Ships ran regular routes between Chesapeake ports and New Orleans. Slave pens operated in major cities along the trade routes. The prices paid for enslaved people generated substantial capital. Historians estimate that the total value of enslaved people in 1860 was approximately $3 billion, more than the value of all railroads and factories in the United States combined. This capital was not confined to the South. Northern banks held mortgages on enslaved people. Northern insurance companies insured them. Northern investors profited from the trade. The financial integration of slavery into the national economy meant that abolition threatened not just Southern planters but the entire financial system. The role of the federal government in maintaining slavery extended beyond the Fugitive Slave Act. The Constitution itself protected slavery through the 3/5 Compromise, which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation, giving Southern states disproportionate political power. The Constitution also included a clause requiring the return of fugitive slaves, a provision that made Northern states complicit in slavery's enforcement. Federal policy supported the expansion of slavery into new territories. The Mexican-American War was fought in part to acquire land for the expansion of slavery. Federal troops were used to suppress slave rebellions and to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. The Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott decision of 1857, ruled that black people, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens and had no rights that white people were bound to respect. This decision, issued 4 years after Solomon's release, confirmed that the legal framework treated black people as a category of beings outside the protections of citizenship. Solomon's freedom, secured through extensive legal effort, was rendered precarious by a Supreme Court ruling that denied the possibility of black citizenship. The psychological impact of 12 years of enslavement on Solomon is something the historical record can only partially capture. His narrative describes the physical violence, the labor, the deprivations. It does not describe the internal experience of having one's identity systematically denied, of being forced to answer to a name that is not one's own, of suppressing all outward signs of education and intelligence to avoid suspicion, of watching others suffer and being unable to intervene. The psychological toll of this enforced invisibility, this compulsory self-erasure, is hinted at in the narrative, but not fully articulated. Solomon wrote that he learned to keep silent, to avoid drawing attention, to perform the role expected of him. This performance was not just external. It required internal discipline, the suppression of hope, the management of despair. The narrative was written after his release, when he had regained his freedom and his name. But the person who wrote the narrative had been shaped by 12 years of enforced silence. The trauma was not something he left behind in Louisiana. It was something he carried back to New York, something that structured his interactions with his family, his community, his sense of self. The reaction of Solomon's family to his return is described briefly in the narrative. His wife had aged. His children were adults. They had continued their lives in his absence, not knowing whether he was alive or dead. The reunion was not the joyful restoration that popular imagination might expect. It was strained, marked by the unbridgeable gap between those who had experienced enslavement and those who had not. Solomon's daughter had married. His sons had taken up trades. They had lived 12 years without a father, and when he returned, he was a stranger marked by experiences they could not comprehend. The narrative does not dwell on this estrangement, but it is present in the brief descriptions of the reunion. The silences in the text suggest dimensions of loss that language could not capture. The return to freedom was not a return to the life Solomon had left. It was entry into a new life shaped by the absence of the old one, by the years that could not be recovered, by the trauma that could not be communicated. The publication of 12 Years a Slave generated speaking invitations for Solomon. He traveled to churches and abolitionist meetings throughout the North, delivering lectures that recounted his experiences. These lectures served multiple purposes. They provided evidence of slavery's brutality. They demonstrated that free black people were vulnerable to kidnapping. They countered pro-slavery arguments that enslaved people were content or that slavery was a benign institution. But the lectures also required Solomon to perform his trauma repeatedly for audiences who consumed his suffering as entertainment and moral instruction. Each lecture required him to revisit the violence, to describe the whippings, to recount the separation from his family, to explain the mechanisms of his enslavement. This repeated performance of trauma was itself a form of exploitation. Solomon's suffering had value as testimony, but that value was extracted through a process that required him to relive the experiences he was trying to move beyond. The audiences that attended these lectures were not neutral. They came with expectations, shaped by abolitionist literature, by racial stereotypes, by their own need to position themselves as morally superior to Southern slaveholders. Solomon had to navigate these expectations while delivering testimony that was accurate and effective. The emotional labor of this performance is not documented, but it can be inferred from the pattern of his public activity. He lectured frequently in the years immediately following his release. By the late 1850s, the lectures had largely ceased. The financial situation of Solomon's family after his return is not well documented, but the available evidence suggests ongoing economic precarity. Anne had worked as a cook to support the family during Solomon's absence. The children had taken up various forms of labor. When Solomon returned, he was in his mid-40s, without significant assets, with 12 years of lost earnings. The royalties from his book provided some income, but they were not sufficient for long-term security. His lecture fees supplemented this income for a few years, but as public interest waned, so did the invitations. The economic marginalization of free black people in the North meant that opportunities for stable, well-paying work were limited. Solomon's skills as a laborer and musician had market value, but that value was constrained by racial discrimination that limited where he could work and how much he could earn. The narrative of his return emphasized freedom and reunion, but it did not address the economic challenges of rebuilding a life after 12 years of forced labor and no compensation. The legal strategy that secured Solomon's release depended on the intervention of a white lawyer, Henry Northup, who had the resources and connections to navigate the Louisiana legal system. Without this intervention, Solomon would have remained enslaved. The dependence on white advocacy was not unique to Solomon's case. Throughout the antebellum period, free black people who were kidnapped and enslaved had little recourse unless they could attract the attention of white allies willing to invest time and money in securing their release. This structural dependency reinforced racial hierarchies even in the context of anti-slavery efforts. Black people could not free themselves through legal means. They required white intermediaries who had standing in courts, who could afford the costs of legal proceedings, who had the social capital to make their claims credible to white judges and juries. This pattern persisted long after slavery ended. The civil rights movement of the 20th century similarly depended on white allies for legal advocacy, for financial support, for political legitimacy. The necessity of this alliance reflected the exclusion of black people from full participation in the legal and political systems that governed their lives. The absence of compensation for Solomon raises questions about the legal understanding of restitution and justice. The law recognized that he had been wrongfully enslaved. It ordered his release, but it provided no mechanism for compensating him for the 12 years of labor that had been stolen, for the psychological harm he had suffered, for the separation from his family. This was not an oversight. It reflected a legal framework that treated the correction of legal status as sufficient remedy. Once Solomon's free status was restored, the law considered the matter resolved. The question of what he was owed for the years of enslavement was not addressed because the legal system did not recognize enslaved labor as something that required compensation. Enslaved people were property. When property was returned to its rightful owner, no additional compensation was owed. The fact that the property in question was a human being whose labor had been exploited did not alter the legal analysis. This framework persisted into Reconstruction and beyond. Formerly enslaved people received no compensation for their labor. The question of reparations was raised and dismissed. The legal system moved on, treating the end of slavery as sufficient justice without addressing the economic consequences of generations of unpaid labor. The silence surrounding Solomon's final years and death is consistent with the broader pattern of historical erasure that characterizes the treatment of black lives in American historical memory. The documentary record preserves what is deemed valuable, what serves institutional or political purposes, what fits into narratives that those in power want to maintain. Solomon's story was valuable as abolitionist testimony. It was useful in demonstrating the horrors of slavery. But once that utility was exhausted, once the political moment passed, once the Civil War resolved the question of slavery's future through violence rather than testimony, Solomon himself became expendable. The record-keeping systems that might have captured his death, that might have noted his burial, that might have preserved his final years, did not prioritize the lives of free black people in upstate New York. Census records were incomplete. Death certificates were not universally issued. Cemetery records were haphazard. The absence of documentation is not evidence that Solomon did not matter to those who knew him, but it is evidence that he did not matter to the institutions that controlled historical memory. The institutional architecture that enabled Solomon's kidnapping included not just slave traders and planters, but also the legal profession, the banking system, the insurance industry, the shipping companies, and the federal government. Lawyers drew up contracts for the sale of enslaved people. Banks provided financing for plantation operations. Insurance companies insured slaveholders against the loss of their human property. Shipping companies transported enslaved people along established routes. Federal courts enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. This was not a conspiracy. It was a system in which each component functioned according to its institutional logic, and the cumulative effect was the maintenance of slavery as a national institution. The people who participated in these institutions were not all ideological defenders of slavery. Many were simply performing their professional roles within a legal framework that treated slavery as legitimate. The bankers who financed plantations were making rational economic decisions. The ship captains who transported enslaved people were fulfilling contracts. The lawyers who drafted bills of sale were providing legal services. The compartmentalization of responsibility allowed each participant to avoid confronting the moral implications of the system they were sustaining. This diffusion of responsibility is characteristic of institutional violence. It allows ordinary people to participate in atrocity without perceiving themselves as complicit. The theological justifications for slavery were not confined to the South. Northern churches were divided on the slavery question, but many Northern denominations avoided taking strong abolitionist positions because their congregations included members with financial ties to the slave economy. Textile manufacturers in New England depended on Southern cotton. Merchants in New York financed the cotton trade. Ship owners in Boston transported enslaved people and slave-produced goods. These economic ties created pressure to avoid alienating Southern partners. The result was theological compromise. Northern churches preached about the importance of gradual emancipation, about the need for slaveholders to treat enslaved people humanely, about the hope that slavery would eventually fade away through economic evolution. These positions allowed Northern Christians to feel morally superior to Southern slaveholders, while avoiding the economic and political disruptions that immediate abolition would entail. The theological debates over slavery were not purely abstract. They were shaped by material interests, by the financial stakes that Northern institutions had in the continuation of the slave economy. The role of women in the maintenance of slavery extended beyond the direct violence, exemplified by Mary Epps. White women in slaveholding families managed household enslaved people. They assigned tasks, enforced discipline, and participated in the buying and selling of enslaved people. They were not passive beneficiaries of a system maintained by men. They were active participants who exercised authority over enslaved people and who benefited economically from their labor. The ideology of white womanhood that developed in the antebellum South positioned white women as morally pure, as civilizing influences, as victims of the brutality of slavery who needed protection from its contaminating effects. This ideology obscured white women's active participation in slavery's violence. It allowed white women to claim innocence while exercising power over enslaved people. The participation of white women in slavery's maintenance complicates narratives that position women solely as victims of patriarchal systems. White women were both subordinated by patriarchal structures and empowered by racial hierarchies. They used the power granted by their racial status to dominate enslaved women, even as they were subordinated by the gendered structures that limited their autonomy relative to white men. The cotton economy that sustained Edwin Epps's plantation was not isolated to the South. Cotton grown in Louisiana was shipped to textile mills in New England and in England. The mills processed the cotton into cloth that was sold in domestic and international markets. The profits from this trade financed the industrial development of the North. The economic integration of slavery into the national and international economy meant that abolishing slavery threatened not just Southern planters, but the entire industrial system that depended on cheap cotton. This economic interdependency shaped the politics of abolition. Northern industrialists who depended on Southern cotton were not enthusiastic supporters of immediate abolition. They supported gradual approaches that would not disrupt the supply of raw materials. The political compromises that delayed abolition, the willingness of Northern politicians to accommodate Southern demands on fugitive slave laws and territorial expansion, were shaped by these economic interests. The moral arguments against slavery had to contend with the material interests that benefited from its continuation. The fact that abolition eventually occurred was not inevitable. It required political mobilization, sectional conflict, and ultimately a civil war that killed more than 600,000 people. The surveillance systems that controlled enslaved people on plantations extended beyond physical oversight. Enslaved people were required to carry passes when traveling off the plantation. Patrols of white men enforced these pass requirements, stopping and questioning any black person found on the roads. The patrols had legal authority to whip those found without passes. This system of surveillance and control created a carceral landscape in which black people's movements were constantly monitored and restricted. The pass system was not unique to slavery. It persisted after emancipation in the form of vagrancy laws, convict leasing, and later Jim Crow segregation. The logic remained the same. Black people's freedom of movement was treated as a threat to social order that required constant regulation. The surveillance mechanisms that controlled Solomon's movements on Epps's plantation were part of a broader architecture of racial control that adapted to legal changes but maintained its essential functi. Of restricting black autonomy. The physical violence of slavery was complemented by forms of psychological violence that are harder to document but no less destructive. Enslaved people were forced to witness the punishment of others, to participate in their own subjugation, to perform cheerfulness and compliance even as they endured brutality. The enforced performance of contentment was itself a form of violence. It required the suppression of authentic emotional responses, the constant management of one's presentation to avoid suspicion, the internalization of a role that denied one's humanity. Solomon's description of the slave pen in New Orleans, where enslaved people were instructed to appear happy and energetic for prospective buyers, captures this dynamic. The performance was not voluntary. It was coerced through the threat of violence. Those who failed to perform adequately were beaten. The psychological cost of this enforced performance is difficult to quantify, but it was real. It required the development of survival skills that involved the compartmentalization of self, the suppression of anger and grief, the cultivation of a public persona that bore no relation to internal experience. The question of resistance within slavery is complicated by the fact that most forms of resistance were invisible to the historical record. Enslaved people engaged in subtle forms of resistance, working slowly, feigning illness, breaking tools, stealing food. These acts did not overthrow the system, but they disrupted it, imposed costs on slaveholders, asserted small measures of autonomy within a system designed to eliminate choice. The historical record captures dramatic acts of resistance, rebellions, escapes, murders of slaveholders. It does not capture the daily incremental resistance that made slavery less efficient, less profitable, less total than it aspired to be. Solomon's narrative hints at these forms of resistance. He describes people who worked slowly, who feigned incompetence, who found ways to carve out small spaces of autonomy. But the narrative focuses primarily on his own experience, on his survival, on his eventual release. The collective dimensions of resistance, the networks of solidarity among enslaved people, the cultural practices that sustained community and identity, are present in the narrative, but not central to it. This reflects the constraints of the genre. Slave narratives were marketed to white audiences who expected stories of individual suffering and redemption. Narratives that emphasized collective resistance, that portrayed enslaved people as active agents rather than passive victims, were less marketable because they challenged the paternalistic assumptions that shaped white anti-slavery sentiment. The legal hearing that secured Solomon's release took place in a Louisiana courtroom, but the outcome was not determined solely by the evidence presented. It was shaped by the political context of the early 1850s, when sectional tensions over slavery were escalating, and northern states were increasingly unwilling to defer to southern legal authority on questions involving free black people. The magistrate who ruled in Solomon's favor was making a decision that had political implications. Ruling against Solomon would have validated the kidnapping of free black citizens, would have signaled that free states could not protect their own citizens from being seized and sold into slavery. This would have escalated the conflict between free and slave states, would have undermined the legal frameworks that maintained an uneasy coexistence. The magistrate's decision to release Solomon was not purely a matter of legal interpretation. It was a political calculation about the costs of different outcomes. The fact that the decision went in Solomon's favor reflects not just the strength of the evidence, but the political context in which the decision was made. The newspaper coverage of Solomon's case, both during his captivity and after his release, reveals the racial assumptions that structured public discourse. Northern newspapers portrayed Solomon as an exceptional individual, educated, industrious, a victim of Southern barbarism. This portrayal served abolitionist purposes by demonstrating that even free, respectable black citizens were vulnerable to the slave system. But it also reinforced the assumption that most enslaved people were different, were less educated, less deserving of sympathy. The emphasis on Solomon's exceptionalism implicitly suggested that his enslavement was particularly unjust because he was not like other enslaved people. This framing limited the abolitionist critique. It allowed readers to condemn Solomon's kidnapping without questioning the legitimacy of enslaving those who were not exceptional, who were not educated, who could not produce documentation of free status. The structural critique that Solomon's narrative offered, the exposure of the systems that enabled kidnapping and enslavement, was subordinated to the individual narrative of an exceptional man who had suffered unjustly. The media's focus on individual victimhood rather than systemic violence is a recurring pattern in American racial discourse. It allows for expressions of sympathy without demanding structural reform. The disappearance of Solomon Northup from the historical record after 1857 is not unique. Many figures who were prominent in antebellum abolitionist circles faded from public view after the Civil War. The political landscape shifted. The concerns that had motivated abolitionist activism, the expansion of slavery, the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, the moral crisis of a nation divided over slavery, were resolved through war and constitutional amendment. The individuals who had provided testimony, who had given lectures, who had written narratives, were no longer needed. Their utility had been exhausted. The nation moved on to other concerns: Reconstruction, industrialization, westward expansion. The narratives of enslaved and formerly enslaved people were relegated to the archives, to be rediscovered by later generations when new political movements created new uses for historical testimony. Solomon's disappearance was not an anomaly. It was the predictable outcome of a system that valued testimony as a political tool, but did not value the individuals who provided it. The mechanisms that allowed Solomon to be kidnapped in 1841 were still operational in modified forms well into the 20th century. The practice of arresting black men on minor charges and leasing them to private employers persisted until the 1940s. The use of legal mechanisms to coerce black labor continued under sharecropping systems that bound workers to land through debt. The surveillance and restriction of black movement through vagrancy laws, sundown towns, and segregation ordinances maintained the carceral landscape that slavery had established. The formal abolition of slavery did not dismantle these mechanisms. It reconfigured them. The 13th Amendment's exception for convicted criminals became the foundation for convict leasing, the legal framework adapted to maintain racial hierarchies and economic exploitation under new terminology. The continuities between slavery and the systems that followed it are not accidental. They reflect the persistence of the underlying logic, the treatment of black people as a labor force to be controlled rather than as citizens with rights. The question that Solomon's narrative raises, the question it does not fully answer, is what happens to a society that builds its prosperity on a foundation of systematic dehumanization. The United States in 1853, when Solomon's narrative was published, was a nation that had spent more than 2 centuries developing legal, economic, and social systems that treated millions of people as property. The wealth generated by this system funded the development of infrastructure, industry, and institutions that defined American modernity. The banks, the railroads, the factories, the universities, all were built with capital accumulated through slavery. When slavery ended, the wealth did not disappear. It was inherited by descendants of slaveholders, by institutions that had profited from the trade. by industries that had depended on slave-produced raw materials. The formerly enslaved received nothing. They were freed into an economy that offered them few opportunities for economic advancement, into a legal system that provided minimal protection for their rights, into a society that continued to treat them as inferior. The legacy of this asymmetry persists. The wealth gap between black and white Americans today is directly traceable to the fact that black families were legally prohibited from accumulating capital for centuries and then denied access to the mechanisms of wealth building, home ownership, education, business ownership that were available to white Americans in the post-slavery period. The final question is why Solomon's grave was never found, why his death was not recorded, why the documentary systems that had been so crucial to establishing his free status failed to capture his end. The answer is structural. Solomon mattered to the historical record when his story served a purpose, when it could be deployed in political struggles over slavery, when it provided evidence that northern audiences wanted to consume. Once that purpose was fulfilled, once the political crisis resolved into war and emancipation, Solomon's individual existence ceased to be valuable to the institutions that controlled historical memory. He disappeared not because his life ended in some dramatic way, but because it ended in the ordinary obscurity that characterized the lives of most free black people in the 19th century. The systems that documented births, marriages, and deaths were inconsistent in their application to black lives. The records that exist are fragmentary, shaped by the priorities of white-controlled institutions that did not prioritize the preservation of black history. The absence of Solomon's grave is not a mystery to be solved. It is a testament to the systematic erasure of black lives from American historical memory, an erasure that was not accidental but structural, not an oversight but a choice made repeatedly by institutions that valued certain stories and discarded others. On the morning of January 4, 1863, 10 years after Solomon Northup regained his freedom, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The document declared that all enslaved people in Confederate states were free. The proclamation did not free those held in border states loyal to the Union. It did not provide compensation to the formerly enslaved. It did not address the legal mechanisms that had enabled Solomon's kidnapping. It did not dismantle the economic systems that had profited from slavery. It freed people by declaration, not by transformation of the structures that had held them. Solomon Northup, wherever he was on that day, whether still living or already dead, whether remembered or forgotten, was not present in the celebrations that marked the proclamation's signing. His story had been told. His testimony had been recorded. His usefulness to history had been exhausted. The nation moved forward into a future that would spend the next century and a half grappling with the legacy of slavery while avoiding the question of reparations, while maintaining systems of racial control under new names, while preserving the wealth accumulated through the labor of those who had been enslaved, and denying that wealth to their descendants. Solomon's narrative had explained exactly how a free man could be unmade. The nation read the explanation, and then chose to forget it, chose to forget him, chose to preserve only the outline of the story without the person who had lived it. The disappearance was complete, not into chains this time, but into an archival silence more absolute than any bondage. A silence that the nation maintained because remembering would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require accountability, and accountability would demand transformation. The story ends not with Solomon's death, because the date and manner of his death remain unknown, but with his erasure, with the nation's choice to extract his testimony and then discard the man, to remember the narrative while forgetting the narrator, to acknowledge the crime while preserving the systems that enabled it. This is the legacy, not redemption, not justice, but a carefully maintained forgetting, a structural amnesia that allows the nation to consume stories of past suffering without confronting present consequences. Solomon Northup told his story. The nation listened, then it chose silence.